beneath the punishing Arizona sun, where the desert swallows sound and mercy is scarce. A man named Levi Cartwright rides the ridgeline with no destination but the fences he swore to keep standing. 52 years have taught him the cost of land, the weight of loss, and the quiet ache of outliving the only person who ever softened him. But on this day, a curl of black smoke on the horizon will pull him into something far more dangerous than stray cattle or a brewing storm. In the ashes of a burned-out wagon, Levi will find an orphaned girl with soot in her hair, fear in her eyes, and a secret stitched into the hem of her only companion, a ragged doll. The men who set that fire aren't finished, and the girl's survival hinges on a promise Levi never planned to make. In a land where law bends to the will of the ruthless one, weathered rancher will have to decide how far he'll go to stand between innocence and the gathering darkness. The Arizona heat bore down like judgment from a godless sky, bleaching the red earth and silencing even the wind. In the distance a hawk circled its cry, a lonely note in an otherwise soundless expanse. Levi Cartwright, a rancher of 52 years and countless regrets, rode his bay gelding along the ridgeline overlooking the trail to Tombstone. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was these days. Not since Margaret died. The years had dulled his anger but sharpened his instinct, and today something about the stillness in the air pulled at his gut like an old scar aching before the storm. Levi wasn't born to this land, but he belonged to it now. 2 decades ago, he and Margaret had carved out the Double Creek Ranch with blistered hands and prayer. She'd been the heart of the place, he'd only ever been the hammer. After she passed, the land stayed alive, but Levi did not. He became a man of few words and fewer visits to town. Folks still respected him. Some feared him, but no one truly knew him anymore. That morning, Levi had set out with no more intention than checking the north fence line. The cattle were restless from a dry lightning storm the night before, and a few stray tracks had led off toward the canyon edge. What he found instead stopped his horse cold. Smoke. Not the kind that meant firewood and beans, the bitter, oily scent of canvas timber and trouble. He nudged his horse forward, muscles tightening beneath his coat as his hand instinctively drifted toward the butt of his revolver. It wasn't paranoia. Not out here. It was survival. The clearing revealed the blackened skeleton of a burned-out wagon still hissing in the heat. Around it, the land looked scraped possessions, scattered tracks trampled a tale of violence told in dust and blood. 2 bodies lay still in the scorched grass, a man and a woman. Their clothes were travel-worn. The woman's arm extended toward the wreckage as if she'd died, reaching for something or someone. Levi dismounted, boot heels crunching the ash-covered earth. He said nothing, just crouched eyes scanning. This wasn't the work of bandits in a hurry. This was surgical, methodical. Whoever did this hadn't just taken supplies. They'd looked for something. He was turning toward his horse when a sound stopped him. A whimper, thin and buried like the cry of something half alive. It came from beneath the wagon. Levi dropped to a knee and peered into the shadows. There, curled tight against the wagon's axle, was a little girl, maybe 8. Her dress, once a cheerful shade of blue, was torn and darkened with soot. Her hair a tangle of auburn and ash. But it was her eyes that froze him, wide, green, not crying, just watching him like a deer might watch the hunter's finger on the trigger. "Hey there," Levi said, voice low and steady. "Ain't gonna hurt you, little miss." She didn't move, didn't blink. "I'm Levi Cartwright. I own a ranch about 10 miles south of here. You're safe now, all right?" Still nothing. He crouched lower, removing his hat and setting it beside him in the dust like an offering. "What's your name?" A breath. Then almost inaudibly, Josie. "Josie Quinn." He looked back at the bodies. "Those your folks?" A nod. Barely. The words came soft, raw, like cracked porcelain. Mama said, If the bad men came, I should hide, until someone good found me. Levi swallowed hard. He'd buried cattle mauled by wolves, buried neighbors shot over water rights. He'd buried his own wife. But this child, hiding beneath splintered wood and sky, cracked something in him he thought long sealed. He reached out, palm-open, voice gentle. "Well, Josie, someone good just did." And as the sun scorched the land above them, something new was set in motion. Not justice, not revenge. Something quieter, but stronger. A promise. The wind had shifted by the time Levi Cartwright helped Josie Quinn from beneath the wreckage. The scent of charred wood lingered thick in the air, mingling with desert sage and the iron tang of blood. She clung to his leg like a shadow, her small fingers digging into the worn leather of his chaps. He didn't rush her. He didn't speak much. He simply stood there beside her, a broad-shouldered wall of silence between the girl and the ugliness that surrounded them. Then came the sound hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several. Coming fast. Levi's spine stiffened. He turned his head toward the ridge eyes narrowing against the sun. A group of 5 riders crested the hill, their silhouettes sharp against the blue sky. Dust kicked up in a trail behind them. They rode like men who didn't expect to be questioned, and Levi knew right away this wasn't coincidence. The lead rider was the first to break away, spurring his horse into the clearing with the arrogance of someone who mistook fear for respect. He was lean, wiry, and wore a tailored black vest that looked too clean for trail work. His hat was low over his brow, but Levi didn't need to see his eyes to recognize him. Franklin Devereaux. The name was whispered in saloons and carved into the memories of grieving families from Tucson to Apache Junction. Claim jumper, cattle thief, cold-eyed negotiator when it suited him, and a murderer when it didn't. Levi had crossed paths with his kind before slick-talking men who believed decency was just a slow kind of weakness. Cartwright Devereaux drawled as he dismounted, hands loose near his gun belt. "Ain't you a little far from home? Far enough to smell smoke?" Levi replied, voice flat. Devereaux's eyes flicked toward the burned wagon, then to Josie, who had taken a step behind Levi, peeking around his leg. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Terrible sight," he said. "Real shame what happened here. Folks say there was a family heading through these parts. Heard they were carrying something valuable, maybe land deeds, or maps. You see anything like that?" Levi's hand hovered near the grip of his Colt, not touching it, but close enough to make a point. "Just saw a tragedy," he said. "Didn't find anything worth stealing." The word hung between them. Devereaux's expression didn't change, but the air shifted. One of his men, a thick-necked brute with a scar cutting through his beard, shifted in his saddle, resting a hand on his rifle stock. Another eased his horse toward the far edge of the clearing as if casually circling. Levi saw it all, noted positions, assessed threats, the way any old rancher learns to scan the horizon for wolves even when the prairie looks calm. Girl looks shook up. Devereaux continued. Probably saw things she shouldn't. Poor thing. Levi stepped more fully in front of her, his frame casting long shadow across the dust. "Most things worth protecting," he said slowly, "ain't easy to guard. But that don't mean I won't do it." Devereaux's jaw ticked. He wasn't used to being refused. He took a step closer, voice lowering. "You and I both know how this works, Cartwright. You didn't see a thing, and this girl, maybe she gets turned over to the circuit judge, ends up in some church orphanage. No one comes looking. Life moves on. I don't reckon she'll be going anywhere but home with me," Levi said. "To what end?" Devereaux asked, irritation seeping in now. "You think this ends with a warm meal and a quilt? This ain't a fairy tale, old man. The folks this girl crossed, they don't let things go, not for long. That's so. Levi's voice didn't rise, but there was iron in it now. The kind of weight that made even foolish men take notice. He took a slow step forward. Dust stirred beneath his boots. His eyes didn't waver. Then they'll have to go through me. And I've buried worse men than you. Behind him, Josie didn't move. She stood stone still, watching the exchange with a child's wide eyes, but an old soul's understanding. Her grip on Levi's duster tightened. Devereaux's men were tense now, their horses skittish. The scarred one leaned in toward his boss, whispering something. Devereaux raised a hand, still locked on Levi's eyes. We're not here to cause trouble, Cartwright. Just asking questions. Well, Levi said you've asked. Now ride. A long beat passed, the kind that makes or breaks a man. Then Devereaux exhaled through his nose a breath of smoke and calculation. He mounted his horse with one smooth motion and looked down at Levi with the false friendliness of a rattler beneath tall grass. You're making this harder than it has to be. Levi didn't blink. That's the only way I know how. With a sharp whistle, Devereaux signaled his men. The group turned and rode out the way they came, but not without glancing back, measuring Levi, measuring the girl, measuring how far they'd go. When they were gone, silence returned, brittle and absolute. Levi looked down. Josie was staring up at him, eyes wide and full of questions she hadn't dared ask. Are they coming back? She asked quietly. Levi bent to meet her eye level, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. Probably, he admitted. But they'll find I'm not so easy to run off. And you're not alone anymore. She nodded, but her small fingers still trembled. Come on, he said, leading her to his horse. Let's get you home. And just like that, the first line in the sand had been drawn. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was something older, simpler. A man had stepped between evil and innocence and decided he wasn't moving. The desert stretched behind them like a fevered memory. For the first hour of the ride, Josie Quinn didn't say a word. She sat stiff in the saddle wedged in front of Levi Cartwright, her hands clutching the horn, while his arms loosely held the reins around her. Every so often, a dry gust of wind kicked up a swirl of dust, and Levi would lean forward just enough to shield her face with the edge of his duster. He didn't speak much either. There wasn't anything to say that would make sense of what she'd just lived through. He knew better than to try and fix grief with words. That kind of pain needed space, silence, and a steady rhythm of hoofbeats. By the time they crested the final rise, the sun was sinking low, painting the foothills in bronze and lavender. Below them, the Double Creek Ranch came into view, a wide split-rail fence curling around the main house, a low barn and two distant windmills creaking in the dusk breeze. Smoke rose from the chimney in a lazy ribbon, a sign of life, of warmth, of something enduring. Josie stirred at the sight, her voice a whisper barely audible over the wind. Is this your home? Levi nodded. It's ours now. He hadn't meant to say that, not out loud, but the words came out like they belonged, and somehow she didn't question them. As they entered the yard, Mrs. Hannah Lee stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a faded apron. At 62, she was still sharp as a whittler's blade, her silver hair tied back in a clean braid, her posture as upright as a schoolma'am's. She squinted at the pair of riders and called out with a mix of welcome and concern. Mr. Levi, your hours late was about to send Tomas out looking. Her voice caught when she saw the girl. Levi dismounted slowly, then reached to lift Josie down. She clung to him instinctively, her small hands fisting into his coat, like she wasn't sure the ground would hold her. Mrs. Lee's eyes softened, and she came down the porch steps without another word. She crouched before Josie, her knees cracking softly. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "you look like you've been through a war." Josie said nothing. She just blinked at the woman eyes, glassy and red-rimmed. Levi rested a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Her name's Josie Quinn. Her folks didn't make it. I found her near Big Rock Pass. She's staying here now, as long as she wants." Mrs. Lee didn't ask questions. She simply rose, opened her arms, and said, "Come on, honey. Let's get you inside." That night, the house felt different. The kettle hissed on the stove. Biscuits baked in the oven, their buttery scent rising like something holy. Josie sat wrapped in one of Levi's old flannel shirts, her dress drying on the clothesline outside. She barely spoke except to say her doll's name, Lila, and to ask very softly if she could sleep with the door open. Levi had pulled an old quilt from the cedar chest, one Margaret had stitched during a winter long gone, and laid it across the bed in the spare room. It had sat unused since Margaret passed, until now. Mrs. Lee sat beside Josie, spooning warm soup into her bowl. "You eat what you can," she said. "Then I'll draw you a bath. Don't worry, I'll be close the whole time." Levi watched from the kitchen doorway, arms folded, boots dusty from the trail. He didn't say much, but in the flickering lamplight, his eyes kept returning to the girl. The way she held her spoon like it might vanish. The way she leaned ever so slightly toward Mrs. Lee, like a plant reaching for sun. After supper, Josie padded softly across the wooden floor and paused by Levi's chair. "Can I sleep with the quilt that smells like flowers?" she asked. "It's yours now," he replied. She nodded, then added almost as an afterthought, "You won't let anyone take me again?" Levi's throat tightened. He set down his mug and looked her square in the eye. "No, Josie. No one's taking you anywhere." That night, after Mrs. Lee had bathed and tucked her in, Levi stood outside the room for a long time, listening. He heard nothing at first, then a small voice floated through the cracked door. "Lila," he said, "no one's taking me. I believe him." Levi turned away, then walking the old hall toward his own room. His boots thudded dully against the worn boards. He hadn't felt this kind of ache in years. Not the pain of loss, but something quieter, deeper. The ache of being needed again. The next morning, dawn came pale and cool. Josie was up before Levi. Mrs. Lee had already gotten her dressed in one of her own old dresses, shortened and pinned to fit. It swallowed her, but she looked proud in it. She helped gather eggs, Mrs. Lee said with a smile. Fed the chickens, too. Josie stood with a cracked enamel bowl in her hands, a single egg nestled inside. She looked up at Levi with wide, waiting eyes. "Can I stay here, even if the bad men come?" Levi crouched so they were eye to eye. "They won't get past me," he said. "And if they do, they won't." And then, for the first time since she'd stepped into his life, Josie smiled. Just a flicker, a fragile thing, but real. Later that day, Levi saddled his horse. He had legal work to tend to in Tombstone. Custody papers, guardianship. But before he left, Josie tugged on his sleeve. "Will you come back today?" He knelt down again, taking her small hand in his. "I gave you my word, didn't I?" She nodded. "Then count on it." And as he rode away, she stood on the porch between the wind chimes and the worn rocking chair, holding Lila in one arm and shielding her eyes with the other, not out of fear this time, but belief. Something had shifted. She wasn't just a girl hiding anymore. She was a girl with a place. The ride to Tombstone was long, but Levi Cartwright welcomed the solitude. Morning light peeled slowly over the ridgelines, washing the desert in shades of gold and rust. The air was dry crisp, humming with cicadas, and every hoofbeat from his gelding echoed in the quiet like a ticking clock. He hadn't slept much the night before, Not from fear, but from a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in years. Purpose. Josie Quinn had arrived in his life like a dust storm, sudden, choking, and full of things he thought he'd buried. He didn't know much about raising a girl, but he knew this: he wasn't letting her go. Not to strangers, not to some cold orphanage with shared cots and indifferent caretakers. And damn sure not to the kind of men who left burning wagons behind them. By the time he passed the worn sign welcoming travelers to Tombstone, Arizona territory, the town was already stirring. The blacksmith was hammering at his forge, shopkeepers swept dust from doorways, and a half-dozen miners staggered out of the saloon still drunk from the night before. Levi tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside, removing his hat as a courtesy. Sheriff Eli Morgan looked up from behind a desk cluttered with wanted posters and dust. He was younger than Levi, clean-shaven and sharp-eyed, with a deputy's badge that actually meant something in this part of the territory. "Levi," he said, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you off the ranch. What brings you in?" Levi didn't sit. He didn't ease into it. "There's a girl. Name's Josie Quinn, 8 years old. I found her after a wagon fire near Big Rock Pass. Her folks were gunned down. I believe Devereaux was involved." Eli's expression hardened. "Franklin Devereaux?" Levi nodded. "He and 4 of his men showed up not long after I found her. Said they were looking for maps, silver surveys. Didn't say it straight, but they made it clear the girl was a problem for them. And she's with you now." "She's at my place. Mrs. Lee's looking after her. She's scared half to death, but she's hanging on." Eli stood slowly, arms crossing. "You think she saw something?" "I know she did," Levi said. "But that ain't the point. The point is, I need legal guardianship. Not next month. Not next week. Today." Eli rubbed his chin. "That's not small ask, Levi. I'm not asking." There was steel in his voice, not anger, but conviction. Eli studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Come on. Let's see Judge McCready." They crossed the dusty main road to the newly built courthouse, red brick with glass windows that still gleamed like they'd been installed yesterday. Inside, the air was cool and quiet. A clerk led them to Judge Silas McCready, who sat behind a desk of polished walnut spectacles balanced on the end of his nose. Levi Cartwright McCready said, extending a hand, "I hear you found yourself in the center of something serious." "I found myself in the middle of something worth protecting," Levi replied. He laid it all out: the wagon, the bodies, the girl. Devereaux's threats, the stolen innocence of a child who had whispered, "Please don't let them take me." When he finished, McCready sat in silence for a time. Then he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Normally, adoptions take months, home visits, witness statements, background checks. But these aren't normal circumstances, and I'm not a man who lets red tape stand in the way of right." He opened a drawer and pulled out a form. "I can issue you temporary guardianship today. That will give you full legal authority to protect and care for her. You'll need 2 witnesses and your signature. I'll bring my foreman and Mrs. Lee in tomorrow," Levi said. McCready slid the document forward. "There's one more thing." Levi raised an eyebrow. "If Devereaux gets wind of this, and he will, he may try to challenge your custody, especially if he thinks the girl has information that could implicate him. Then let him try. I'll also issue a restraining order. He and his men come near your ranch. You have full authority to respond, legally and otherwise." Levi took the pen and signed. Each stroke of ink felt like a chain breaking loose from the grief that had shackled him for years. As he tucked the folded document into his vest, he thought of Josie standing barefoot in Mrs. Lee's kitchen, holding a single egg like it was treasure. He thought of how she'd asked if he'd come back, and how he'd promised her without hesitation, count on it. When he returned to the Double Creek Ranch that evening, the shadows were stretching long across the corral. He spotted Josie sitting on the porch rail, her threadbare doll clutched to her chest, eyes fixed on the horizon, like a lookout scanning for hope. As soon as she saw him, she scrambled down and ran across the yard. "You came back," she breathed. Levi knelt and held out the paper. "I told you I would." She stared at it, confused. "This makes it real," he said. "You're mine now. No one can take you. Not ever." A long silence passed before she spoke. Can I call you Papa?" Levi hadn't cried since Margaret's funeral, but something in his chest cracked just wide enough to let the light in. "I'd be honored." Later that night, Josie drifted off to sleep with the legal document tucked beneath her pillow like a prayer. Levi sat on the porch beside Mrs. Lee, sipping coffee under the stars. "She called me Papa," he said. Mrs. Lee smiled without looking over. "Well, maybe you were waiting to be called that again." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the desert. "I think I was." And in that quiet, Levi Cartwright realized something profound, that the law might make a man a guardian, but it's love that makes him a father. Autumn came slow to the Arizona territory, not in color, but in feel. The air in the mornings no longer clawed at the throat with heat. It whispered instead, carrying the scent of mesquite ash and turned soil. At Double Creek Ranch, the days were steady and full. Josie Quinn, now legally Josie Cartwright, had settled into a rhythm of life, feeding chickens before sunup, reading aloud by the hearth in the evenings, laughing at Tomas Rivera's terrible jokes, and pestering Mrs. Lee in the kitchen with flour-covered fingers. It had been nearly 3 months since Levi Cartwright had signed the guardianship papers in Judge McCready's office, and in that time the haunted, hollow-eyed girl he'd found beneath a burned wagon had grown sturdier, steadier. But some nights, she still paused at the window after the lamps were out, as if listening for something just outside the reach of safety. On one such night, the sky turned pale blue as dusk bled into darkness. Josie sat cross-legged on the floor of her room, her doll, a ragged, one-eyed thing named Lila, resting in her lap. The window was open a crack, letting in the cool scent of sagebrush. Levi passed by her door, paused and knocked lightly on the frame. "You all right in here?" he asked. Josie glanced up, hesitated, then nodded. "I was just thinking." Levi stepped in and sat on the edge of the bed. "About what?" She looked down at Lila. "About my mama." Levi said nothing, just let the silence hang gently between them like laundry on a line. After a long moment, she said, "Papa, there's something I need to show you." The word still caught him, Papa. He hadn't stopped marveling at how she said it, how easily it had become part of his name. Josie set the doll aside, fingers moving with practiced care. She reached beneath the hem of its dress and began unpicking stitches from a seam near its back, using a small sewing needle Mrs. Lee had given her last week. "I never told anyone," she whispered, "because Mama said I had to wait, until I was sure, until I felt safe." When the last thread came loose, she reached inside and pulled out a bundle of papers, yellowed, folded, small, and still bearing the faint scent of fire. Levi's brows furrowed. "What's that?" "My mama hid them in Lila the morning they died. She said they were important, said bad men wanted them, but they belonged to good people. She told me, don't give them to anyone, unless your heart knows they're good." Levi took the papers, unfolding them slowly. What he saw made his stomach turn cold. Geological survey maps. Detailed ones. Not just random notes, but government-level assessments full of notations, plotted silver veins, projected yields. They spanned half the county, including parts of his own land. "My folks weren't just passing through, were they?" Josie asked quietly. "They were carrying this." Levi nodded slowly. "They were scouts, Maybe working for a mining company. Or maybe trying to sell claims themselves. Is that why they died? He didn't answer right away. It's part of it, but it doesn't change the most important thing. What's that? That they loved you more than anything. Enough to hide these in your doll. Enough to trust you to carry them. Josie looked down, her voice small. Am I in danger again? You're under my roof, he said firmly. And as long as you are, no one gets to hurt you. Not Devereaux, not anyone. She nodded, then added, but when I'm older, what do I do with them? Levi unfolded the largest map again, eyes tracing the ridge lines, the shaded deposits. By law, the claims would fall to you. Your parents were the last documented holders, so I'll be rich maybe. But you'll also be responsible. You'll have a say in what happens to this land, and the people on it. Josie was quiet a long time. Then she said, do you think we could use some of it to help kids like me? The ones without homes. Maybe build a place for them to go. Levi looked at her, then really looked. Not as a lost child, not even just as his daughter, but as someone rising into herself. You're thinking like Margaret, he said softly. She used to talk about that. A place where no child had to feel unwanted. Josie smiled faintly. Then maybe I'm where I was supposed to end up. Later that evening, they sat together on the porch. Mrs. Lee brought out coffee for Levi and warm cider for Josie. The stars blinked overhead in a sky clear as truth. She's a rare one, Mrs. Lee said, watching Josie tuck the papers back into the doll with fresh stitches. Yeah, Levi replied. She's made of tougher stuff than most grown men I know. You gonna keep those maps locked up, I'll put them in the safe, for now. But when she turns 18, they're hers. All of it. The land, the choices, the future. Mrs. Lee nodded in approval, and until then, Levi looked at the girls, still small, still soft-spoken, but carrying something bigger than her frame had room for. Until then, he said, I'll carry the weight. Inside, Josie knelt beside her bed, speaking to Lila in that soft voice children reserve for things they trust. I told him, she said. He didn't get mad. He said they're mine. But I'm not going to keep it all, just enough for us. The rest we'll use to help the ones still waiting to be found. She paused, then whispered, Mama would be proud. I think. Outside, Levi sat in the dark, feeling something settle in his chest. Not grief, not guilt, but the kind of peace that only comes when a promise made in blood and ash is met with hope and purpose. Josie had carried the secret. Now she was carrying the future. And for the first time in years, Levi Cartwright believed in both. The first frost came like a whisper, soft and silver along the fence lines of Double Creek Ranch, clinging to the tall grass and wooden rails, with the quiet promise of winter. The sun rose slower now, but the days still stretched wide and golden. In the kitchen, the scent of bread baking mingled with fresh coffee and the faint sweetness of dried apples hanging from the rafters. Josie Cartwright, now 8.5 and 3 inches taller than when she arrived, stood barefoot on a stool, kneading dough beside Mrs. Hannah Lee, both of them dusted with flour and humming something half-remembered. Levi Cartwright watched from the doorway, arms crossed loosely, a cup of hot coffee nestled in one calloused hand. He couldn't help but smile, not the guarded grin he wore when folks in town greeted him, but the quiet kind that bloomed from somewhere deep in the ribs. The ranch had always been land and duty and the ghost of what once was, but now it breathed again, not because of cattle or rain, but because a little girl who once hid beneath a wagon believed this place could be hers. Outside, the corral creaked as Tomas Rivera led in 2 new colts, while the barn cat slipped like smoke through the fence slats. Life moved simple and steady. 3 days earlier, word had arrived by courier Franklin Devereaux was dead. Gunned down in a gambling hall south of Tucson. Levi hadn't cheered, hadn't even cursed the man. Just folded the letter, tucked it into the fireplace, and let the flames carry it into the past where it belonged. Now peace was no longer a thing they hoped for. It was real, tangible. A thing you could hear in Josie's laughter and taste in Mrs. Lee's biscuits. That evening, just before supper, Judge Silas McCready and Sheriff Eli Morgan rode up the drive. They didn't come with warnings or reports, but with something heavier. Josie McCready said, kneeling down with a small envelope in hand, "I've got something for you," from the court. Inside was a parchment folded neat and tight, stamped with the seal of the Arizona Territorial Judge. At the top, in ink still drying, it read, "Josie Margaret Cartwright, legal daughter of Levi Cartwright, protected ward of the state." She traced her finger along the letters. "That's really me." Levi knelt beside her. Forever and always. She didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she reached for his hand and said, "I'd like to frame it. Hang it next to Mama's picture, so I always remember where I come from and where I ended up." Later that night, Levi found her out on the porch, curled up in his old coat with her doll beside her. The moon hung low and the stars burned bright over the open range. "Papa," she said softly, "do you think my real parents would be okay with me being this happy?" Levi sat beside her, his arms settling around her shoulders. "I think they'd be proud. Not just because you survived, but because you kept your heart open. That's harder than hiding." She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "I think we should start that place, for kids like me. You know, the ones still hiding." "We will," Levi said. "We'll build it together." And in the hush of the desert, beneath a sky full of promise, the man who had once buried his hope found it growing again, not in a woman's memory, but in a child's future. They didn't just survive the fire. They built something from its ashes, together. If you believe in the power of storytelling, to heal, to honor, and to remember, subscribe to Whispers of the West. Every week we bring you cinematic tales of redemption, quiet love, and frontier courage. Don't miss a single whisper from the past. Like, share, and join our growing community of Western hearts.